Imagine being born into a world where your very existence is considered a legal problem, requiring constant surveillance and control, where every breath you take must be monitored, every step you make must be approved, every word you speak must be filtered through male authority, and every thought you entertain must be confessed to ensure it aligns with the narrow boundaries of acceptable female consciousness. This was not mere social custom or religious tradition, but the systematic legal architecture of medieval Europe, a comprehensive framework of laws, regulations, and judicial practices designed to transform women from human beings into legal property, from individuals with inherent rights to objects requiring constant management by fathers, husbands, brothers, and the omnipresent machinery of church and state. These were not the familiar restrictions taught in sanitized history books, but a labyrinthine system of legal terrorism that penetrated every aspect of female existence with such thoroughness that rebellion became not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable, as the law itself had redefined female nature, in ways that made resistance appear as evidence of supernatural corruption or demonic possession. The medieval legal system did not merely discriminate against women. It constructed an alternative reality in which women existed as perpetual minors, temporary vessels, dangerous temptations, and potential sources of contamination that required constant containment through laws so comprehensive and contradictory that perfect compliance was impossible, while any violation provided justification for escalating control. In the shadowed halls of cathedral courts and royal chambers, male legislators and theologians labored with obsessive precision to craft legal frameworks that would govern every aspect of female experience from birth to death, creating elaborate taxonomies of forbidden behaviors, mandatory submissions, and prescribed roles that transformed the basic functions of female biology into occasions for legal intervention and moral judgment. The laws of coverture represent perhaps the most fundamental and comprehensive system of legal erasure ever devised, transforming marriage from a partnership into a form of civil death in which women ceased to exist as legal persons and became instead extensions of their husband's legal identity, property, and will. Under coverture, a married woman could not own property, sign contracts, conduct business, inherit assets, or even control her own earnings without explicit permission from her husband, who legally owned not only her possessions, but her labor, her body, and her children. The law was so complete in its erasure of female legal identity that married women were referred to in legal documents as femmes couvertes, literally covered women, whose individual existence was subsumed entirely within their husband's legal persona. Courts treated married women as legally non-existent beings whose testimony was invalid, whose contracts were void, and whose crimes were considered the responsibility of their husbands rather than their own autonomous actions. The system created impossible situations where women were simultaneously held responsible for their behavior while being legally incapable of taking responsibility, where they were punished for actions they were legally prohibited from taking, while being forbidden from defending themselves against accusations through legal processes that required capacity they were denied. Widowhood provided only limited relief, as women who outlived their husbands found their legal existence restored but immediately threatened by male relatives, creditors, and courts that questioned their competence to manage affairs that had been legally theirs before marriage but had been transferred to deceased husbands during coverture. The restrictions on economic activity created a comprehensive system of financial dependency that made female survival contingent on male approval and transformed any attempt at economic independence into evidence of moral corruption or supernatural influence. Women were forbidden from joining most craft guilds, prevented from establishing independent businesses, barred from many forms of trade and commerce, and restricted in their ability to inherit, transfer, or control property in ways that ensured lifelong economic vulnerability. The few economic activities permitted to women, brewing, textile work, midwifery, small-scale retail, were heavily regulated and could be revoked at any time based on accusations of impropriety, incompetence, or behavior deemed inappropriate for female nature. Even women who successfully engaged in permitted economic activities found their earnings subject to confiscation by male relatives, their business contracts requiring male co-signers, and their commercial disputes adjudicated by courts that presumed female incompetence and frequently ruled in favor of male competitors, regardless of evidence. The law created systematic disadvantages that made female economic success nearly impossible, while simultaneously condemning women who failed to support themselves as burdens on their families and communities, creating psychological frameworks where women were blamed for economic dependency that was legally mandated. Unmarried women faced particular persecution, as their economic independence was viewed as evidence of moral corruption, supernatural influence, or dangerous autonomy that threatened social order, and required systematic suppression through legal and social mechanisms designed to force them into marriage or religious institutions where their economic activity could be controlled by male authority. The laws governing reproduction transformed the basic biological functions of female bodies into matters of state interest, subject to extensive legal regulation, medical intervention, and moral judgment that made pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing occasions for systematic control rather than personal experience. Women were legally required to report pregnancies to authorities, submit to examinations by male physicians and midwives approved by church and state, and follow prescribed regimens during pregnancy that were designed more to ensure production of legitimate heirs than to protect maternal health. Contraception and abortion were not merely prohibited, but constituted capital offenses that could result in execution for both women and anyone who assisted them, while the definition of these crimes was deliberately vague enough to criminalize miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant mortality that could be attributed to maternal negligence or moral corruption. Childbirth itself became a legal proceeding, requiring witnesses to verify legitimacy, paternity, and proper conduct during labor, transforming the most intimate and vulnerable moments of female experience into public spectacles subject to official scrutiny and legal documentation. Women who gave birth to children outside marriage faced not only social condemnation, but legal punishment that could include public whipping, branding, exile, or execution, while their children were permanently marked as illegitimate and excluded from inheritance rights, educational opportunities, and social acceptance. The law extended control over wet nursing, childcare practices, and maternal behavior in ways that made motherhood itself a form of supervised labor, subject to official approval and constant intervention by authorities who claimed expertise in areas where women had traditionally held knowledge and authority. The sexual regulation laws created comprehensive systems for controlling female sexuality that went far beyond prohibiting adultery to encompass detailed regulation of female behavior, appearance, and social interaction in ways that made normal human relationships potential criminal activities. Women were forbidden from appearing alone in public spaces, engaging in conversation with men outside their immediate families, participating in social activities without proper supervision, or displaying any behavior that could be interpreted as sexually provocative or morally questionable. The definitions of sexual misconduct were deliberately vague and expansive, allowing authorities to criminalize everything from smiling at men to wearing attractive clothing to walking with insufficient modesty, creating legal frameworks where nearly any female behavior could be interpreted as evidence of sexual impropriety. Courts presumed female guilt in sexual matters while simultaneously denying women the right to testify in their own defense, creating judicial systems where accusations of sexual misconduct were virtually impossible to disprove, while carrying penalties that could include public humiliation, physical punishment, exile, or execution. The law created impossible double standards, where women were simultaneously expected to be sexually available to their husbands, while being condemned for any expression of sexual desire, required to be attractive enough to secure marriage, while being punished for any behavior that attracted male attention, and held responsible for male sexual behavior, while being denied any control over sexual encounters or reproductive consequences. Rape laws were constructed in ways that made prosecution nearly impossible, while often resulting in punishment for female victims who were accused of provoking attacks through inappropriate behavior, inadequate resistance, or failure to maintain proper modesty and supervision. The religious conduct laws subjected women to heightened spiritual scrutiny and regulation, that transformed religious practice from personal relationship with the divine into systematically monitored performance subject to male clerical authority and constant evaluation for signs of heretical deviation or supernatural corruption. Women were forbidden from preaching, teaching religious doctrine, interpreting scripture, or claiming direct divine revelation without approval from male religious authorities who presumed female spiritual inferiority and susceptibility to demonic influence. Female religious expression was systematically channeled into forms that reinforced male authority: passive prayer, submission to clerical guidance, domestic religious duties, and charitable activities that required male supervision and approval. Women who displayed unusual religious devotion, claimed mystical experiences, or demonstrated theological knowledge were subject to investigation for heresy, witchcraft, or demonic possession, as female spiritual authority was presumed to be either fraudulent or supernatural in origin, rather than legitimate religious development. The law required women to confess their thoughts, feelings, and spiritual experiences to male priests who used this information not only for spiritual guidance, but for monitoring female behavior and identifying potential threats to religious and social order. Even women's participation in approved religious activities was heavily regulated, with restrictions on their access to religious education, their participation in religious ceremonies, and their ability to make independent religious choices or donations without male approval. The property and inheritance laws systematically excluded women from controlling or inheriting family wealth in ways that ensured their economic dependency and prevented the accumulation of female power or independence across generations. Women were typically prohibited from inheriting land, titles, or significant assets, except in extraordinary circumstances and under conditions that severely limited their control over inherited property. Even when women did inherit property, they were required to transfer control to male relatives or husbands, could not sell or dispose of inherited assets without male approval, and faced constant legal challenges from male relatives who questioned their competence to manage inherited wealth. The law created complex systems of male guardianship that extended throughout women's lives, ensuring that property nominally owned by women was actually controlled by fathers, husbands, brothers, or court-appointed male guardians who made all significant financial decisions. Women were prohibited from making wills disposing of property without male approval, could not serve as executors of estates, and were systematically excluded from business partnerships, land ownership, and other forms of wealth accumulation that might provide economic independence or social power. The system was designed to ensure that wealth remained under male control across generations while creating legal fictions that appeared to grant women property rights while actually subordinating those rights to comprehensive male oversight and ultimate control. The marriage and divorce laws transformed marriage from a personal relationship into a form of legal bondage that was nearly impossible to escape, while simultaneously being legally mandatory for women who wished to avoid social and economic destruction. Women had little or no control over their choice of marriage partners, as marriages were typically arranged by male relatives for economic, political, or social advantage rather than personal compatibility or preference. Once married, women found divorce nearly impossible to obtain regardless of circumstances, as the legal standards for divorce heavily favored male interests while creating insurmountable barriers for women seeking to escape abusive, incompatible, or economically disastrous marriages. The few grounds for divorce available to women, typically limited to extreme physical abuse or male abandonment, required levels of proof that were nearly impossible to establish in legal systems that discounted female testimony while granting extensive credibility to male witnesses and authorities. Women who did manage to obtain divorces found themselves in worse legal and economic positions than before marriage, as they lost access to their husband's property and social status while being stigmatized as failed wives whose moral corruption had destroyed their families. The law created powerful incentives for women to remain in unhappy or abusive marriages, while simultaneously condemning them for the failure of relationships over which they had little control and from which they had few means of escape. The educational restriction laws systematically denied women access to formal education, literacy training, and intellectual development in ways that ensured their intellectual dependency and prevented the development of knowledge or skills that might challenge male authority or enable female independence. Women were excluded from universities, prohibited from studying law, medicine, theology, and other learned professions, and often forbidden from learning to read and write beyond the minimal levels necessary for domestic religious duties. The justification for educational restrictions was rooted in theological and legal theories that portrayed female intellectual capacity as inferior to male capacity and female learning as dangerous to social order and spiritual development. Women who displayed unusual intellectual abilities or learning were subject to investigation for witchcraft or supernatural influence, as female intelligence was presumed to be either fraudulent or evidence of demonic assistance rather than natural capacity. The law created systematic barriers to female intellectual development while simultaneously condemning women for the intellectual inferiority that legal restrictions had created, establishing psychological frameworks where women internalized beliefs about their own intellectual inadequacy that served to justify continued educational exclusion. Even women from wealthy families who could afford private tutoring found their education strictly limited to domestic skills, basic religious instruction, and accomplishments deemed appropriate for their social station, rather than substantial intellectual development that might enable independent thought or economic activity. The travel and movement restrictions confined women to severely limited geographical and social spaces through laws that required male permission for virtually any movement beyond the immediate household, transforming physical mobility into a privilege granted or withheld by male authority rather than a basic human right. Women were forbidden from traveling alone, required to obtain permission from fathers, husbands, or male guardians for any journey beyond their immediate neighborhood, and subject to arrest as vagrants or prostitutes if found traveling without proper male escort or authorization. The restrictions applied not only to long-distance travel, but to daily movement within communities, as women faced legal consequences for appearing in certain public spaces, visiting particular establishments, or engaging in social activities without appropriate supervision. The law created systems of internal passport control where women's movement was constantly monitored and regulated by authorities who presumed that unsupervised female movement indicated moral corruption, sexual availability, or criminal intent. Women who violated movement restrictions faced punishments ranging from public humiliation to imprisonment, while their male relatives could also be held responsible for failing to properly control female behavior. The dress and appearance laws regulated female clothing, grooming, and physical presentation with obsessive detail that transformed personal appearance into a form of legal communication, subject to official interpretation and potential criminal charges. Women were required to dress in ways that indicated their social status, marital condition, and moral character, through complex codes that specified acceptable colors, fabrics, styles, and accessories, while forbidding forms of dress that might be interpreted as sexually provocative, socially inappropriate, or morally questionable. The laws included detailed regulations governing hair coverings, necklines, skirt lengths, jewelry, cosmetics, and even posture and gait, creating comprehensive systems for visual identification and control of female behavior through appearance requirements. Violations of dress codes could result in fines, public humiliation, physical punishment, or more serious charges if appearance violations were interpreted as evidence of prostitution, adultery, or moral corruption. The law created impossible standards, where women were simultaneously required to be attractive enough to secure marriage while being forbidden from any form of self-decoration that might attract inappropriate attention, required to display their social status through clothing, while being restricted in their access to clothing appropriate to their station. Women from different social classes faced different appearance requirements, with elaborate systems of visual markers that made class transgression through dress a form of fraud punishable by law, while simultaneously requiring women to maintain appearance standards that might be economically impossible given their restricted access to resources. The legal testimony and court access laws systematically excluded women from legal processes in ways that made them unable to defend their interests, seek justice for wrongs committed against them, or participate in the legal system, except as objects of legal action rather than legal agents. Women's testimony was generally considered unreliable and was often excluded from court proceedings, while their ability to bring legal cases, serve as witnesses, or participate in legal processes was severely restricted or prohibited entirely. The legal system presumed female incompetence, dishonesty, and emotional instability. While simultaneously holding women responsible for legal obligations they were prohibited from fulfilling through normal legal processes. Women who were victims of crimes often found themselves unable to seek legal remedy because their testimony was inadmissible, their credibility was presumed compromised, and their access to legal representation was limited or prohibited by laws that required male intermediaries for all legal action. The system created situations where women were legally responsible for obligations they could not legally fulfill while being unable to seek legal protection from violations of rights. They were not legally recognized as possessing, creating frameworks of legal impossibility that ensured female vulnerability while maintaining the fiction of legal equality. The professional and occupational restriction laws barred women from most forms of skilled labor, professional practice, and economic activity that might provide independence or social authority, while simultaneously condemning them for economic dependency that legal restrictions had created. Women were excluded from legal practice, medical practice except as assistants to male physicians, teaching except in very limited contexts, and most forms of craft production and trade that required guild membership or professional licensing. The restrictions were justified through theological and legal theories that portrayed women as intellectually and morally unsuited for professional responsibility, while creating economic systems that ensured female dependence on male support and approval. Women who violated professional restrictions faced not only loss of livelihood, but potential criminal charges for fraud practicing without license or exceeding the bounds of appropriate female activity, while their families could also face legal consequences for permitting inappropriate female behavior. The law created systematic barriers to female economic development, while simultaneously stigmatizing women who required economic support as burdens on their families and communities, establishing psychological frameworks where women internalized shame about economic dependency that legal restrictions had made inevitable. The consequences of legal violation for women extended far beyond individual punishment to encompass systematic destruction of family relationships, social standing, and future prospects in ways that made any challenge to female legal restrictions potentially catastrophic for women and their relatives. Women who violated legal restrictions faced punishments that were often more severe than those imposed on men for similar offenses, while their violations were interpreted as evidence of fundamental moral corruption rather than simple rule-breaking or reasonable resistance to unjust restrictions. The legal system created cascading consequences where single violations could lead to permanent social exile, economic destruction, and family disgrace that extended across generations and affected not only the women directly involved, but their children, relatives, and associates who might be contaminated by association with female transgression. Women who challenged legal restrictions found themselves subject to investigation for witchcraft heresy or supernatural influence, as female resistance to male authority was presumed to be either evidence of moral corruption or supernatural assistance, rather than legitimate response to systemic oppression. The legacy of medieval women's laws extends far beyond their historical context, to illuminate enduring patterns of legal and social control that continue to shape women's experiences and limit female autonomy through mechanisms that have evolved but not disappeared from contemporary legal and social systems. The medieval legal framework created psychological and cultural patterns that normalized female dependency, legitimized male authority, and established frameworks for interpreting female behavior that continue to influence contemporary attitudes toward women's rights, capabilities, and appropriate social roles. Understanding these historical legal restrictions provides crucial insight into the systematic nature of gender oppression and reveals how legal systems can be used to create and maintain inequality while maintaining the fiction of justice and fairness through complex regulatory frameworks that appear neutral but systematically disadvantage targeted populations. The comprehensive nature of medieval women's legal restrictions demonstrates the tremendous effort required to maintain systems of oppression and reveals the artificial nature of gender inequality that required constant legal reinforcement rather than emerging naturally from inherent differences between men and women. As you contemplate these systematic legal restrictions that governed every aspect of female existence in medieval Europe, consider how many contemporary limitations on women's autonomy, economic opportunity, and social authority echo the same patterns of control that medieval legislators and theologians constructed through their comprehensive frameworks of legal oppression disguised as natural law and divine command. The medieval legal system's treatment of women reveals the capacity of legal institutions to transform systematic oppression into apparently legitimate governance while creating psychological frameworks that made resistance appear not only dangerous but morally wrong, demonstrating the enduring importance of legal literacy and critical analysis for recognizing and challenging systems of control that operate through complex regulatory mechanisms rather than obvious force. If this exploration of history's most comprehensive system of legal gender oppression has illuminated patterns of control that extend beyond medieval practices into contemporary experience, share your insights, subscribe for more investigations into the hidden mechanisms of systematic oppression, and remember that understanding historical injustice provides essential knowledge for recognizing and resisting similar patterns in modern legal and social systems. Would you have recognized the systematic nature of medieval women's legal oppression while living under its influence? Or would you have accepted these restrictions as natural expressions of divine will and social necessity rather than artificial constructions designed to maintain male power and female dependency?